Long Island Backstory with Chief Correspondent Gary Jacobs.
Good evening, I'm Gary Jacobs, and welcome to another edition of Long Island Backstory, where we're filming at the Cablevision/Alt-T Studios in Hop Hog, Long Island. I'm going to get right to my next guest. He's got a very long bio, but I read it every time he's been on my show. So suffice to say, if he's been on my show more than 2 or 3 times, he's a good guest, and he's very qualified to talk about the topic. So my guest today is Phillip J Jusino from Jusino Law, a law office in Lake Grove here on Long Island. As I said, he's been a guest on my show several times. He's sort of the person I go to when we have questions that I want answered, because he's very generous about giving out his information and sharing with the audience his knowledge of almost 30 years practicing law. Phil has his own show also here at Alt-T's and on YouTube. Just Google WLINY and you can see many shows. As an advocate, people come to me and ask me a lot of questions about court, and they ask me how something is going to come out, which way is it going to go, and they tell me, oh, my lawyer told me this, my friends told me this. The truth is, a lot of times we don't know, but there are some things that we do know, and some things are more black and white than others. I never say that anything in family court is truly black and white, because anything can happen. I've had some people come to me and say, I'm going into family court, Gary, I got a slam dunk case. And as far as I'm concerned, there is no such thing as a slam dunk case, because anything could happen. But one of the questions people ask me is about equitable distribution. What does it mean? Where is it going to come out? They come in many times before they file for divorce. They say, if I get divorced, what's going to happen to my assets? In the profession, they call this ED. Now, people who are watching, there are 2 different kinds, actually it's probably more than 2 different kinds of ED. So the one ED, erectile dysfunction, may be caused by the other ED, which is equitable distribution. And when I was running for office several years ago, they came to me and they said, well, Gary, tell us about your ED. And I'm like, oh shit, did they talk to my girlfriend or something? But what they're talking about was my electoral district. So in this case today, just to be clear, the ED that we're talking about is equitable distribution. So Phil, thank you for coming on the show and sharing this with us. First of all, explain to the audience what is equitable distribution, because a lot of people think equitable distribution means we split the assets 50-50. What does it mean?
No, equitable distribution is the distribution of assets in a divorce action, Gary. You can't do it in family court. It has to be Supreme Court.
You can't do it in family?
No.
Okay.
Family court cannot handle the distribution of assets.
Okay.
And it's only marital assets. So if you have separate property, that doesn't get divvied up. Equitable distribution is the distribution of marital assets.
Okay, so when we're talking about the 50, when people say, all right, it's not 50-50, it's called equitable distribution. Right. To me, equitable means fair. Does this mean fair?
It does.
Okay, but I guess fair is in the eye of the beholder.
As a practical matter, in New York State, and I can only speak from experience, the distribution of assets is generally 50-50. So if there's a house and there's $200,000 of equity, usually the husband gets 100, the wife gets 100. Okay. The judge has discretion to divvy it up differently. Okay, so that's why we hear about the people who have like a car, and you've seen it on Facebook where they take the chainsaw and they cut the car down the, yeah, or the house or something like that. So now, of course, the next question is, what is marital property? Because a lot of times, especially now, I think more than ever, with divorce rate being so high, there's a lot of remarriage. Sure. So somebody comes into it with a home that they got from their first marriage. Maybe it's paid off, maybe there's not, because we're on Long Island. What is marital property? Well, first, very quickly, there's a 3-pronged test. The first thing is classification. That's, is it marital or non-marital, separate. The second one is evaluation, what's it worth, and then the distribution is what the judge decides to do with it. Okay. That's the only area he has discretion. Okay. So the question was, what is a marital asset? Right. A marital asset is any asset that the parties either purchased or acquired together, generally during the marriage. An asset could be separate and become marital, right, or marital and become separate, but generally anything that is purchased during the marriage or acquired. Even an inheritance, Gary, can be marital if it's given to both parties. Right. Or we'll get to later transmutation, but suffice it to say, an asset is marital if it's a house purchased, a car's purchased during the marriage, that would be deemed marital. So now what happens, we talk about the house, like, so the example I said, somebody gets divorced, and let's just say the woman, and in her divorce, she gets the house. Right. Let's say it has 50% equity. Well, let's say it has $100,000 equity. They get married, the new husband, because he's a guy and he got kicked out of his house, probably lost it,
to his wife.
Right.
So now he moves into this woman's house, and the woman pays the mortgage, but he contributes to the household. Maybe he says, all right, the deal we have is, honey, you pay the mortgage, but I'll pay for the electric and the lawn maintenance.
Okay.
Now what happens to that house? Is that marital property, or does the woman own it separately?
Unless she puts his name on the deed.
Okay.
It doesn't become marital. That doesn't mean he can't get a credit. So the classification's still marital. He would have to prove that it went up in value.
Right.
And he contributed in some way to it going up.
But what's contributing is if he paid for just electric or stuff like that, didn't actually pay
that
for
would probably be
a home improvement.
That would be weak. But if he could show that, let's say he contributed to the mortgage every month,
right,
he could then get a credit. It wouldn't be 50% of the house, but he could get a credit.
So if somebody's watching and they think there's a possibility of getting divorced, they would, let's say they make one mortgage payment. Does that all of a sudden screw up, break the whole thing?
No.
So you can't say, listen, start paying the mortgage if you think you're going to get divorced. Say, honey, you know what? For Christmas, I'm going to pay the mortgage. No. That doesn't just throw the whole thing.
One little thing is not going to be fatal. You have to look at the big picture.
Okay. So let me ask you a couple things that we talk. What are considered marital? Like you mentioned, you talked about inheritance.
Right.
So if they give it to their son, the parents pass away, and in their will it says my son gets it. That's clearly giving it to the son, right?
Right. That's separate property.
Separate. What keeps it separate?
Unless he commingled it. So let's say I inherit $1 million and I'm married.
Right.
If I put that in a separate account, my wife could never touch
with just
that
your
money.
name on it.
Just my name on it.
However, that's tough if you're married.
But there are cases where the guy puts into a joint account.
Right.
And let's say a year later he moves it into another account. The courts have held that's a matter of convenience. Because maybe the guy didn't have a second account.
Right. That doesn't look good to your wife to say I'm opening up an account.
But they look at the facts. If let's say I took that $1 million, I stuck it in a joint account, my wife took money out, I took money out, we used it for marital bills or things like that, a court could say, you know what, you commingled it. Now it's marital.
So by being a nice guy,
potentially,
screws up if he's,
keep it separate. I always tell my clients, you inherit any money, keep it separate in a separate account. Now,
then you end up in divorce court.
Now, if you use that money, well, let's say you inherit $1 million.
Right.
And I say, you know what, I want to take $200,000 of that money and buy my wife a fancy car.
Right.
That other $800,000 is still separate property.
Okay.
But once I buy my wife a car, let's say, that converts that 200 to separate property.
So what if you have that account and you pull money out to say pay for your children's college? Does that?
Unless you have something in writing, that's no longer in the separate property realm.
That's tough. That's harsh.
So if I was the husband, you could do what they call a postnuptial agreement. Say, I'm going to take out 200, but I don't want to. This is still my separate property.
But again, that's difficult.
It is
in a marriage. So I guess really, it's almost the advice that you would be giving to somebody who wants to will money to their children would probably be to say, this money is designated for my son or for my daughter and should be put in a separate account. Then you make it easy, wouldn't it?
Well, they don't even have to go that far. Just make sure that it's not given to both parties. So if you leave $1 million to my son and his wife, guess what? That's marital.
Right.
But if he leaves it to the son and he just takes that money and sticks in, go and open a separate account. That's all you got to do.
Right. But it's easier said than done. So now what about third-party gifts? For example, a lot of people, not a lot of people, but some people have a lot of money and they have to give away some money every year for tax purposes. I've never been in this horrible situation, but they want to give $10,000 and they give it to the couple, and let's say the couple puts it in the bank.
Right. But if it's given to the couple, that's easy.
But what determines if it's given to the couple?
The check to Joe and Mary. That's marital.
Right.
To Joe, that's separate.
But what if the card, then they pull out a card, and the card is addressed to Joe and Mary, but the check is made out to the husband?
I would go by the document that got the money into the bank. Let's say a check or a wire transfer.
Right.
That's what I would look at.
That would be, okay. Now what about personal injury? The wife gets into a car accident, she's the one who's hurt, she gets a settlement of $100,000, and 3 years later they get divorced. Is the husband entitled to 50% of the $100,000?
If she kept that property separate, that's almost like an inheritance.
Okay,
right?
Same.
The only thing would be if the husband was also a plaintiff. You know how they sue loss of services and all that?
Right.
If the husband is also a plaintiff, he will get about 10 to 15% of that claim.
Really?
Yes.
So it's a percent?
Because he's a plaintiff. If he's not a plaintiff, he doesn't.
Okay.
Unless she commingles it.
Right. So the commingle is the big thing here.
So
now when you go to court on something like this, who has the burden of proof? Because this is like something that's hard to disprove almost.
Right.
So whose burden is it your burden to prove that it's my asset, or is it the other burdens to prove to say, no, it's not your?
Believe it or not, it's an easy one. It's the one who's claiming it's separate property. If it came about during the marriage, there's a presumption. Just like a child, we talk about a child born during the marriage, there's a presumption that the father, the husband is the biological father. It's rebuttable. Here too. So if someone says that's a separate property, like in other words, if I inherited $1 million,
right,
and I took that money and I bought a house and I kept it in my name only, that came about during the marriage. Wouldn't that be marital? It's deemed marital, but I can come forward and say that's separate because I can show the chain of the monies where it came from.
Now, what about the growth on the house, though? So you buy the house, and it's your house, separate property. It's in Phil Jusino's name, but then you get divorced, and now the house is worth twice as much. Is it still?
Well, if it's marital, it's easy. You divvy it up 50-50, thereabouts. If it's separate property, the spouse that wants to make a claim to that separate property has to get two values. Has to get a value at the time. Like I'll give you. Let's talk about transmutation. Very simple.
Okay.
I get married and I own that. Remember you said the lady had a house? Let's say I have a house.
Right.
And I get married and I say, you know what, I'm a nice guy. I'm going to put my wife's name on the deed. Right. So 5 years into the marriage, I put her name on the deed. That transmutes it to a marital asset.
Right.
But that's not the end of the story.
So transmuting is converting? Is that another word?
That's correct, yes. But that's not the end of the story because I get a separate property claim. I have to get the value of the house the day she went on the deed.
Okay.
So let's say there was let's forget about a mortgage for a second. Let's say the house had a value of $100,000 on the day I put her on the mortgage.
Right.
And then the house went up to $200,000. She gets half of the appreciation.
And he gets the whole original.
He gets the $100,000.
I see that.
But now let's say it's separate property, and I didn't put her name on. But let's say she puts money into the house. Well, let's say she contributes in some way to that asset, like a business or something. She can make a claim for credits.
So what if she's, in this example, what if she says, you know what, my husband worked all the time and I stayed home and I remodeled the kitchen and the bathroom. I didn't put any money in and it's in his name, but I put money into the house. I mean, put physical work, that happens though.
That might be enough to get a small claim. It's something that usually a piece of it. Not a big piece.
No, obvious. I would think the length of the marriage you can't be married for a month and then get divorced and then that's it. All of a sudden, well, maybe you can. Nothing can surprise me.
If it's marital, it doesn't matter if you were married a week.
Really?
Or if you were married 100 years. It wouldn't matter.
That's scary.
It's a factor of the distribution. So the judge could say, you know what, it's a long duration marriage. The wife has no prospects. The husband's a rich guy. I'm going to give her 70% of the house. The judge can do that.
So somebody could say it's not really, I don't think it's fair, right? The judge can give more to the other person. I saw a show that you did where you explained where the earnings potential has something to do with it. So they could say right now it may not seem fair, I'm giving the wife more in equitable distribution, but in the long term, this guy's making a big salary.
And that would be a case, maybe a long duration marriage. If the parties are married for a very short time, you're probably looking at 50-50.
Right.
And as a practical matter, judges don't like to do math.
Right.
So they're going to say, what is it worth? 200? 100,000 each.
Right.
Unless there's some compelling
But when there's
reason.
big money, then everybody brings in their forensic accountants.
And there are many factors. Tax consequences. You might be getting an asset, there's no tax consequence. Someone else might be getting, or the spouse may be getting an asset where there is a tax consequence. So the judge can shift it a little bit.
Right. Now what about let's say let's say the mother gets custody, because we're in Suffolk County.
Right.
I had to put that little dig in there. But it happens. Let's say the mother gets custody, she's in the house, and now she says, well, if we're going to split it up, I'm not going to be able to afford this house anymore. But then the husband says, well, my only asset is my house. Right. Which is very common here on Long Island. You have no money in the bank, you're house rich, and now what do? Can the judge say, I'm forcing you to sell the house so you can both live, or too bad, she has the kid, she stays in the house?
This is what they do. If there were no kids, it would be easier.
Right.
If there are kids, it depends. If you have a case where, let's say the couple has a kid that's 2 and a kid that's 3, and they don't have enough money to carry the house, a judge can say, you got to sell the house. You can't afford to stay there. However, let's say the kids are 17 and 16. The court's going to say, let's try to keep her in the house until the last one graduates high school. Because kids in 10th, 11th grade, they don't want to be, or 12th, they don't want to be moving.
Right.
So the court might say, ma'am, you could stay in the house, and once your last kid graduates high school, you put the house on the market.
Right. So what about do they look at the practicality of it? For example, again, we're using that sort of example, the mother gets custody and the father says, look, if we do this equitable distribution, we don't have any money, but we don't even have a big equity in the house. So basically that's our only asset. It's worth $100,000. It doesn't really pay to sell it, and we have a little bit of money in the bank. But if we split this, I can't live because now she's in the house with the mortgage, but I have nowhere to go. I can't rent an apartment. Can they look at the needs of
They
the
do.
non-custodial parent and say,
Right.
you're going to leave them with no money?
Right. They look at the feasibility of her staying in the house. Like
Okay.
I said, if they're barely making it as a couple, he moves out. He's going
Very
to have to pay rent.
Right.
Then he's, reverse economies of scale. He can't afford to live this.
So they do look at that, Phil? They will look at and go and say, look, I'm not going to be left
They
with
do.
enough money to live?
They do.
Okay. So what about
the kids' needs are paramount.
Right.
But they do look at the
But sometimes,
needs.
listen, like you said in your example, sometimes people could barely live when they were married together.
Right.
Well, now when they got one income,
Well, a
it's
court
certainly
could
going to
say,
be a problem.
Sell the house. Court
Right.
can do that.
So what about a forensic accountant? Should they be hired? What's your
Depends.
feeling on that?
Okay. If you want to value a business, you generally need to do that because a house is easy. You can get a market analysis and you say that house is worth 500.
Right.
A business is totally different. And if you're going to value a business, you need a professional.
Right.
Unless the parties agree. And if I'm an attorney, I might not even allow that because I might say, I don't want to commit malpractice. Right. What if the business is worth $1 million and the husband said it's only worth 100 and the wife takes only 10-15% of that business?
Right.
She's getting screwed.
Right.
So I would say, I want to know what this business is worth.
Right. So what about retirement plans, 401ks? If that person only put their own money into it,
Right.
well, listen, everybody considers it their money, right? They go, well, I earned it, it's my money.
Right.
But of course, in reality, it's not that.
Believe it or not, retirement accounts are one of the easier areas.
Right. Explain the quadro thing, the qualified domestic
First
relations.
if it's a pension, even if the husband wanted to give the wife half, he couldn't do that.
Right.
A Supreme Court judge would have to sign what they call a domestic relations order that becomes a qualified domestic relations order. That goes to the pension fund and they set up an account for the wife.
Okay.
Almost like she worked there.
Right.
Now, let's say a guy's a cop and he started in 2000 and he gets divorced in 2010. What they do is they look at when he started as a police officer or the date of marriage, whichever is later, up until the time of the filing. So a 3-year divorce, they still look at 2016 or 15 as the date. They call it the Majaskis formula. That's the case that everyone talks about.
Okay.
There's a numerator, denominator. The husband gets credit, or the wife, whoever it is, for the separate property before they got married. So if he was a cop 10 years before he got married, that's his property.
Okay.
So I always say to my client, if they're let's say the spouse, I say, you're going to get half of the marital portion.
Right.
I don't know what the marital portion is yet.
And it's not that easy, right? I mean, it's like a formula.
We hire
a company to...
no attorney in his right mind would touch a quadro.
Right. And then they go to this Lexington or something, and they have some
Crockett's Quadros. There are reputable companies out there. They do the calculation because they have to get the information from the quadro. I'm sorry, from the pension fund.
Right.
Now, sometimes you don't need a quadro. You can do a rollover.
Which is?
Where let's say it's a 401k or an IRA. You might not need to do a quadro. You say, husband's going to get $20,000. He goes to Charles Schwab, let's say, opens an account, and they roll over the $10,000.
Okay.
So you don't need a quadro. But a pension, you definitely do.
Now, sometimes I hear of people, they say, well, I want to keep my pension, so I'll give more.
Of course, trade.
So this can be something that you can do, right? Somebody's, look, that's gold to me. I don't want to give up my pension.
Right. I've seen it where the guy says, you know what? Here's a big pension. I want to keep the pension, and I'll give you the house.
Right.
As the attorney, you have to find out what the values are.
Right.
It's great if they're equal.
Right.
But the other problem is, let's say the wife doesn't make a lot of money. Okay, she gets the house. Who's paying the mortgage? Who's paying the property taxes? It's a way to do it, but it's got to be feasible.
Now, I have one that I didn't hear on your show, but it came up in my divorce, so I'll ask it. What about frequent flyer miles?
Mm-hmm. That could be considered an asset.
Because in my case, it was. They wanted to split my half my frequent flyer miles.
It can be if it's an asset, if it has value.
Right.
It can be an asset if it came about during the marriage.
Right. Yeah, they did. My wife wanted my frequent
just
flyer
like
miles.
enhanced earnings. Very very important, guys. Very important. Years ago, not that many years ago, enhanced earnings. You heard of that?
No.
So a guy during the marriage becomes a doctor or lawyer.
Okay.
He increased his income going forward. It used to be an asset. The law changed. So if he became a doctor, that's a factor for maintenance, but it's not treated as an asset anymore.
Really? Okay.
It used to be.
They used to say, well, we put
it's
him
worth
through school.
$100,000.
Right.
Not anymore.
Oh, that's interesting.
They look at it as potential, like if a woman, let's say, doesn't have much of a work history, but she became a doctor during the marriage, and now she can make a lot of money, her maintenance might be less.
Which it makes sense to me, though, because otherwise, to me, it's double dipping. You're saying, look, I want to get the money for the enhanced things, but then they're basing their spousal support and child support based on that higher earning. Right. So the person's sort of double dipping the other way when they're making it an asset.
Well, they look at what their earning potential is. It used to be, like if you, let's say you have a 4-year degree, this is what your income is. if you become a doctor, this is what your income is. Then they calculate the difference.
Right.
You could still do that, but it's not an asset anymore.
But you talk about earning potential. That's scary because a lot of these judges impute the income,
They do.
and a lot of times they don't impute it to the wife because they go, well, she was home taking care of the kids.
Right. My experience has been they almost always, in the cases I've seen, they almost always do that.
But they do it low. They say, well, you could work at Home Depot or Walgreens and make
right.
$25,000 a year.
If she has no college degree, they're going to usually say 25. If she has a college degree, 25 is pretty common.
Right. That's what I hear them say.
Right.
Like, come on.
If they have a degree, they might say 35, 40.
Right.
If they have an advanced degree, but then it depends. If they have an advanced degree, but let's say they haven't worked in 20 years,
right.
they can't just go out and get a job making that same amount of money.
Right.
So that's why good lawyering comes in. You make the argument for your client, say, look, they might have a doctorate, but she hasn't worked in 20 years.
Unless you're on the other side and you go, come on, she should be out working the way the market is right now.
Depends on your client.
She can jump out there. So what about liquid assets, Phil? Somebody, not that people have a lot these days, but some people do accumulate money and they may have $100,000 liquid assets in the bank. But and many times people start to try to dissipate that and they spend it on lawyers' fees.
Right.
How does this all get hashed out? Because from what I've seen, they do the pendente lite and they go, it's subject to reallocation. Don't worry about it, but it usually doesn't happen.
With regard to when you say a liquid asset, let's say $100,000 in the bank.
Right.
That's an asset. If it came about during the marriage, it's generally
and let's be clear, if they have $100,000 and they hire a lawyer, it'll be a moot point. Because the lawyers will suck. The lawyers will suck it down by the time. Come on, I had to throw that in, Phil. Right. Not if they hired Jusino law firm.
You didn't mention the term, but there's a thing called wasteful dissipation.
Right.
So if there's $100,000, let's say the guy goes out or the woman and starts spending money like a drunken sailor.
Right. Which happens quite often.
I'll give you an example. Let's say the guy has a woman on the side and he buys her a ring for $10,000.
Right.
You know what happens? The court, if she can prove it, the court's going to say, write a check for $5,000 to your wife because you dissipated wastefully $10,000.
And actually, and I experience this, so if somebody's having an affair too, and you can prove, let's say the wife is taking the new boyfriend out to dinner all the time and paying for hotel rooms.
If it comes from, let's say, a joint credit card, yes.
Yeah, and that, just so the viewers know, that gives you the right to subpoena the person if they deny it. So if you ask them about it and they say, well, I don't know, well, who would know? And if you know the guy, and this could be a bargaining chip, it's a little dirty fighting, but Americans for legal reform, we gotta win, we gotta win. Let me ask you, because I read this, actually it was on one of your papers, you were talking about equitable distribution, and there was an appellate judge, Robert Smith, who said in the Fields v. Fields case, it's very hard to predict how an equitable distribution dispute will come out, except that the more sympathetic party usually wins. I didn't really understand if it was sarcasm, or I didn't really get what he meant there.
It's funny, and I'm not gonna take credit for what I'm about to say. I go to a seminar every year, it's called Tippins, and he says, bad cases make bad law. So let's say you have a case where the guy is a son of a bee. I don't know if I can say the word, but he's a son of a bee.
Right.
It's called the son of a bee law, meaning that if the judge says that this guy should get less, that makes bad law. Because let's say I'm an attorney and I'm reading a case, and I'm like, why did the woman get so much? It doesn't seem like it's fair.
Right.
So what that judge is referring to is in certain cases where, let's say the judge says, this guy's a real bad guy or that woman's a bad guy, they can give the other side more.
They can.
But it shouldn't be just because the person's a son of a bee. It could be bad conduct. It could be wasteful dissipation. It shouldn't be that the judge doesn't like this guy.
But that does. I mean, I think we have to see that the judge. That's why the clients
judges are human beings.
If you have an attorney, if you have a client who's an asshole, the judge says just sit there and shut your mouth and smile. But as you know, sometimes your clients don't listen.
Well, that's why I say to my clients, even in the hallway, Gary, behave yourself. Because when you act like a jerk in the hallway, court officers, court personnel, it gets back to the judge.
That's very good advice to the viewers, because listen, you don't want to come across like, and sometimes you may not be a jerk. You're just going through a stressful situation.
You're angry, you say something, but it can come back to haunt you.
And it does, because I've heard it and you've heard it. The court officer will go back in and go, that guy's an ass, they throw him out. And I really believe the judges take notes, because I see them up there taking notes, and they have hundreds of cases. But yet, if you'd said something or acted like a jerk, when you come back the next time, the judge remembers it. And I don't think he remembers it.
And
I think
even
he
if the judge is not intentionally doing it, we're human beings.
You can't help it.
If there are two people in front of us, and one's a great person and one's a jerk, and we have to make a decision, come on.
An error, of course. Absolutely.
We may find a little prejudice there and do something not based on the law, even though we should.
Absolutely. So we're out of time, but thank you for telling me. I think that answers a lot of questions. You can see Phil has this book that you can get on Amazon. It's sort of a beginner's guide, and it's really just a guideline. But if you have questions, whether you're thinking about filing or somebody filed against you, this is something that you really do need to speak to a lawyer about, because there's all different nuances, as far as what's marital. If you both came in with no money, you were married for 20 years, I think it's going to be pretty simple, and anybody can tell you, but these cases are never simple. I'm Gary Jacobs, and thank you again for watching us at Long Island Backstory. If you'd like more information on my guest, you can go to JusinoLaw.com. Correct. JusinoLaw.com. He's also on Facebook, and you can go to YouTube and Google WLINY, and Phil has a lot of shows on different subjects, and you can get basically free legal advice, free consultation. And
I'll tease Saturdays, 10 in the morning, channel 115.
Thank you very much. We'll see everybody next week.
Gary Jacobs and Long Island Backstory, winner of the Huntington Lodge No. 124's 2018 Community Service Award in recognition of the efforts to offer an alternative access to news stories of interest to all Long Islanders. Long Island Backstory is made possible in part by Americans for Legal Reform, the oldest, most successful legal group in the world. P.O. Box 2679, Huntington Station, New York 11746. Telephone 631-421-6390. Website Americans4legalreform.com.
Todd's a great guy. I mean, look at him. What a sweetheart. Attaboy. Wait, Todd, what are you doing? How totally selfish and un-Todd-like of you. Come on, Todd. Come on, man.
I tried Oxy at a couple of parties. I didn't know it'd be this addictive. I didn't know how far I'd go to get more.
Opioid dependence can happen after just 5 days. Know the truth, spread the truth.
I don't remember how it started. Our back and forth. Victory. Fumble. Repeat. It always came back.
Okay, here we go, throw it! Yeah.
You probably don't remember what you told me.
That was perfect.
But I heard every word.
Nice.
Red hat. Oops. Red shirt, blue shirt, yellow shirt, oops. Yellow pants, red pants, green pants,